Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back. Forget your heated blankets and your memory foam pillows for a moment. Picture this. You're standing on a shingle beach, a biting wind whipping your hair across your face, stinging your eyes. The air is thick with the smell of salt damp earth and something else. Wood smoke, perhaps, but faint, like a distant, hesitant promise of warmth. Before you stretches a landscape that is anything but inviting. Dark, dense forests crowd the horizon, looking less like an enchanted wonderland and more like a place where you'd lose your way, or worse, become someone else's lunch. The sky above is a vast, indifferent gray, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you question your life choices. This is Anglo-Saxon England, roughly between the 5th and 11th centuries. And let's be brutally honest from the outset. If you were suddenly dropped here with your current set of skills, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not for long, anyway. It was a time of immense hardship, a daily struggle against the elements, against hunger, against your fellow human beings. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help the channel find other curious minds like yours. And while you're at it, I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from tonight. Drop your city or country and the local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our little community spread across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The rough wooden hull of the shallow draft boat grates against the pebbles as you drag it further ashore, your muscles screaming in protest. This isn't a planned holiday, a scenic getaway. This is arrival. Whether you're a hopeful migrant seeking new lands after the Roman legions packed up and left Britain to its own devices, or perhaps a trader blown off course, the feeling is the same, a profound sense of unease mixed with a grim determination. The journey itself across the notoriously choppy North Sea was likely a brutal experience, leaving you weakened and queasy. You probably shared your transport with a crowd of others, livestock, and precious few belongings, maybe some seed grain, a few tools, a weapon, if you're lucky. Your 5-star accommodation upon landing is a patch of slightly less muddy ground, and the welcome wagon is nowhere in sight. You take a deeper breath, trying to steady yourself, but the air itself feels heavy, laden with moisture. This land is wet. It's a place of persistent drizzle, of clinging fogs that roll in from the sea or rise from the extensive marshes, blurring the edges of reality and making every shadow seem like a lurking threat. You'd think they invented 50 words for drizzle here, each one describing a slightly different way the dampness can make your life miserable. Forget the later romanticized visions of a merry England, with its sun-dappled glades and maypole dances. What you're seeing is far more primal, more challenging. The Romans, with their penchant for order and paved roads, have been gone for a while now, and their infrastructure is slowly, inexorably being reclaimed by nature. Those famous straight roads, they might still exist in places, but many are fractured, overgrown, sinking back into the earth, becoming treacherous paths rather than reliable arteries of travel. Your gaze sweeps inland. Forest, so much forest. Not the managed woodlands you might be familiar with, but vast, ancient, untamed wildernesses. The Old English word weald captures it. A wild, unenclosed forest teeming with life, yes, but also with danger. Wolves are a genuine concern, not just a fairy tale menace. And wild boar, formidable and aggressive. Even finding your way through such terrain without maps or signposts is a monumental task. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig puts you on edge. Historians still argue whether the initial Anglo-Saxon settlement was a predominantly violent invasion, displacing the native Romano-Britons, or a more gradual process of migration and assimilation. But whichever it was, for individuals like you stepping onto this shore in those early centuries, the land itself felt like an adversary to be overcome, or at least cautiously negotiated with. The very act of creating a space to live is a testament to human endurance. You see patches where the great trees have been felled, or more likely ring-barked, a slower process of cutting a ring through the bark to kill the tree, letting it stand and dry out before attempting to clear it. The stumps are immense, the ground around them churned and uneven. This isn't just about building a hut. It's about carving out a tiny island of human dominion in a sea of wildness. The effort involved is staggering, all done with simple iron tools. Axes, adzes, perhaps a rudimentary plow if a community is established. The coastline itself is a ragged frontier. In many places, it's not sandy beaches, but treacherous salt marshes, estuaries, and mudflats. These areas, while difficult, also offer resources: reeds, for thatching wildfowl, for the potfish and shellfish, if you know how and where to look. Rivers are the lifelines, the main highways for travel and trade, but they also serve as convenient entry points for less welcome visitors. Raiders from across the sea, a threat that will only grow as the centuries wear on. One of the fascinating things that survives from this period are the place names. As settlements slowly took root, people named their new homes based on the landscape around them. A lea, or ley, often signified a clearing in the woods, a den, a wooded valley, an a river, and a tun, an enclosure or farmstead, which later became our word town. Imagine standing in a freshly won clearing, the smell of sawn green wood, and turned earth in your nostrils, and giving it a name. A small act of claiming, of making the unknown known. It's a subtle reminder that amidst the struggle, people were building new communities, a new culture, literally shaping the land, and being shaped by it in return. These early settlers were predominantly Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, bringing their languages, customs, and a hearty, pragmatic approach to life. They weren't stepping into a vacuum. Romano-British communities still existed, and the interaction between these groups is a complex tapestry that scholars continue to unpick. But for you right now, theoretical history offers little comfort. The wind picks up again, carrying with it the distant howl of something that definitely isn't a domestic dog. Your clothes are damp, your stomach is hollow, and the light is already beginning to fade, even though it can't be that late in the day. The sheer scale of the wilderness, the raw, untamed nature of this new home is overwhelming. It's a land that demands resilience, a land that will test you to your limits, and then some. The immediate concerns are shelter from the elements and finding your next meal. The beauty here is a harsh, stark kind one that doesn't offer easy comforts, only the promise of unceasing effort. The silence when the wind drops is profound, broken only by the cries of unfamiliar birds or the endless sigh of the waves on the shore. It's a silence that speaks of isolation, of being a very small part of a very big and often very indifferent world. You pull your thin cloak tighter, a shiver running down your spine that has little to do with the cold. This is your new reality. Welcome to Anglo-Saxon England. That profound sense of unease you felt standing on that windswept shore, quickly crystallizes into a more immediate and pressing concern: hunger. Your stomach, already hollow from the journey, now rumbles with a primal urgency. This new reality, this Anglo-Saxon England, isn't a place where meals appear with the tap of an app or a stroll to the local supermarket. Sustenance here is earned, wrung from the earth through relentless backbreaking labor, a daily grind that dictates the rhythm of your entire existence. Forget Soul Cycle. Your new fitness regime is soul-crushing plowing, and it runs from before the sun even considers peeking over the horizon until your body screams for rest. The agricultural year is a wheel that never truly stops turning, and you are but one of the many figures pushing it. As soon as the worst of the winter recedes, if it ever truly does, the plowing begins. You're likely working with an ARD, a simple scratch plow, perhaps tipped with a little precious iron, but often just fire-hardened wood. It doesn't neatly turn the soil like later moldboard plows. It just gouges a furrow. Imagine trying to drag this thing through heavy, wet clay soil, often with a team of weary, underfed oxen who understand the drudgery just as well as you do. Your shoulders burn, your hands are raw, your feet slip in the mud, and by the end of the day, every muscle fiber sings a lament of exhaustion. And this isn't just for a small garden patch. You're part of a community effort to cultivate enough land to feed everyone through the lean months ahead. The open field system, where land was divided into strips in large communal fields, was taking shape. This meant you might have several strips scattered around, necessitating even more trudging from one to another. Once the land is prepared, it's time for sowing. You walk the furrows, broadcasting seed by hand from a leather or cloth bag slung over your shoulder. There's a rhythm to it, a practiced flick of the wrist, but also a constant prayer under your breath that the birds don't get too much, that the rain will be timely, but not torrential, that the seeds will actually germinate. Every seed is precious. It represents a gamble against future hunger. Then comes the weeding and endless battle. Nature, remember, is always trying to reclaim this patch you've so laboriously cleared. Young plants are choked by opportunistic weeds, and you spend countless hours bent over pulling them out by hand or with a small hoe. If all goes well, if the weather cooperates, a very big if. Then comes the harvest. This is a period of intense, frantic activity. The entire community, men, women, and children old enough to work, are out in the fields, from dawn till dusk. You're using sickles for reaping grain like barley, oats, rye. And if you're in a particularly fertile area, perhaps some wheat. The rhythmic swish of the blades, the sun beating down, or more likely a persistent drizzle soaking you through the constant stooping and gathering. It's punishing work. A good harvest means survival, a chance to breathe a little easier. A poor harvest, and the specter of famine looms terrifyingly large. The hunger months. Those grim weeks before the first new crops can be gathered are a stark reality many face. Even after the crops are cut, the work isn't over. The grain needs to be threshed to separate it from the stalks, often by beating it with flails on a hard-packed earthen floor. Then it's winnowed, tossed into the air, so the wind can carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grain. Every step is manual, demanding, and dusty. And what are you working so hard for? Well, your diet isn't exactly going to win any Michelin stars. Today's special gray, yesterday's special also gray. The staples are grains cooked into a thick porridge or pottage or ground into coarse flour for dense, rather uninspiring bread. Grinding that flour itself is a daily chore often done by women using a rotary quern. Two heavy stones, one turning on the other, a monotonous, arm-aching task. Vegetables. If you can grow them, include things like peas, beans, perhaps some cabbages, onions, leeks, and parsnips. Though these aren't the sweet, tender varieties you might know, but tougher, earthier ancestors. Meat is a luxury for most ordinary folk. Pigs are relatively common because they can forage in the woodlands for acorns and roots, so pork might appear on special occasions. Cattle are incredibly valuable for plowing and milk, so beef is rare unless an animal is old or injured. Sheep provide wool and some milk, so mutton or lamb might be an occasional treat. Hunting game, like deer, is often a privilege reserved for the local lord or the king. Get caught poaching, and the penalties are severe, so you supplement your diet by foraging. The woods and hedgerows offer nuts, berries, wild herbs, and roots if you know what to look for and where to find it. These aren't just tasty additions. They can be vital sources of nutrients, the difference between getting by and succumbing to deficiency diseases. And to drink water from rivers and wells can be risky, often contaminated. The solution for many is ale. Weak small beer, but generally safer than the water. It's brewed by the women of the household and is a daily staple. For a real treat, perhaps, at a feast or celebration, there's mead, a potent, sweet alcoholic drink made from fermented honey. Honey is the primary sweetener, as sugar is centuries away from being common. Beekeeping is therefore a surprisingly important skill. Quirky as it sounds, special wicker and dung hives called skeps house these vital pollinators. Perhaps this was the original buzz marketing, ensuring a supply of that precious golden liquid. All this work is done with tools that are by our standards incredibly primitive. Many are made mostly of wood, with iron used sparingly for cutting edges because it's a valuable commodity. An iron axe head, a plowshare, the blade of a sickle. These are prized possessions carefully maintained. There's no mechanization, no pesticides, no fertilizers beyond animal manure, and whatever compost you can create. You are entirely reliant on your own strength, the strength of your animals, and the whims of nature. Historians still argue whether the average Anglo-Saxon peasant had a nutritionally adequate diet or lived on the constant edge of malnutrition. Given the evidence of skeletal remains, which often show signs of arrested growth and vitamin deficiencies, it seems many were indeed perpetually undernourished. You are likely a ceorl, a free peasant farmer, the backbone of Anglo-Saxon society. You have your own land, or rights to work strips in the communal fields, but you also have obligations. You owe a food rent, the fiorm, to your local lord, a tribute of grain ale livestock or other produce. This ensures his larders are full, even if yours are sometimes perilously bare. The sheer effort of producing enough for your family and enough to satisfy these obligations means your days are a blur of physical exertion. As dusk finally settles, casting long shadows over the fields you've toiled in, you trudge back to your smoky hut, every bone aching, caked in dirt and sweat, to a meager meal and a brief, exhausted sleep before it all begins again. The only certainty is the rising sun and the work that awaits. The sun has long since abandoned you to the deepening twilight as you finally stumble towards what you call home. Every bone, every sinew is engaged in a dull, throbbing protest against the day's relentless toil in the fields. Your anticipation of rest is tempered by the knowledge of what awaits you, not a sanctuary of comfort and cleanliness, but your smoky, crowded hovel. From the outside, it's not exactly a picturesque cottage from a storybook. It's a low, somewhat lumpy structure, likely built with a timber frame, perhaps using the distinctive curved timbers of Kruk construction, with walls made of wattle and daub. That's a fancy way of saying woven sticks plastered with a delightful mixture of clay soil, straw, and perhaps some animal dung for good measure. The roof is a thick thatch of reeds or straw, which, while offering decent insulation, when new, eventually becomes home to various small creatures and tends to leak in interesting and unpredictable places. There are no gleaming windows. If there are any openings besides the single doorway, they're small, unglazed slits covered by wooden shutters, or perhaps a piece of stretched animal skin, more to keep the worst of the weather out than to let the light in. You push open the creaky wooden door, or maybe it's just a heavy hide flap, and step inside. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Oh, the smell. It's a rich, multi-layered tapestry of aromas that would send a modern nose running for the hills. Dominating everything is the acrid, pervasive scent of wood smoke. There's a central hearth, a shallow pit on the earthen floor, where the fire for cooking and warmth smolders, but there's no chimney as you'd know it. A small hole in the roof, theoretically above the fire, is supposed to let the smoke out, but in reality, a good portion of it decides to hang around, filling the single room with a perpetual haze. This airborne soup stings your eyes, making them water, and rasps at your throat. You're pretty sure your lungs have aged about 20 years since you arrived in this era. Beneath the smoke, other fragrances mingle. There's the damp, earthy smell of the floor itself, which is just packed dirt, perhaps unevenly strewn with some straw or rushes. These floor coverings, meant to offer a modicum of comfort, quickly become trodden with mud-spilled food and other less identifiable substances. They're changed. Well, not nearly as often as you'd like. Then there's the smell of unwashed bodies, yours included. Bathing isn't a daily ritual involving scented soaps and hot running water. It's a rare and rather public affair, if it happens at all beyond a quick splash in a cold stream. Add to this the aroma of stale food, the faint but insistent tang of the chamber pot in the corner, because there's certainly no ensuite bathroom, and quite frequently the close personal scent of livestock. Yes, you heard that right. On cold nights, or if there's a threat of predators two-legged or four-legged, it's common practice to bring some of your more valuable animals inside with you. A few chickens clucking in a corner, perhaps a piglet or two, maybe even a calf if it's particularly vulnerable. It makes sense from a security and warmth perspective. Animal body heat is a bonus, but it does mean sharing your already cramped living space with creatures not known for their impeccable hygiene. Hope you like sleeping next to a goat that's seen better days and has very strong opinions about personal space. This close cohabitation also means the floor is even less sanitary than it would be otherwise. Light is a precious commodity. During the day, what little illumination filters in through the open door or the tiny window slits makes the interior gloomy and full of shadows. At night, the flickering flames of the central hearth provide the main source of light, casting dancing, often unsettling shadows on the rough walls. Perhaps you have a tallow candle or a rushlight, a reed dipped in animal fat, but these are used sparingly. The overall impression is one of perpetual dimness, a world seen in shades of brown and gray, punctuated by the orange glow of the fire. As for furnishings, think minimalist, but not in a trendy, decluttered way. Minimalist because you own very little. Rough-hewn wooden benches might line the walls. A crude table is a possibility, but meals are just as often eaten from a bowl balanced on your lap. Sleeping arrangements usually consist of straw palliasses or just piles of bracken laid directly on the floor, perhaps on slightly raised earthen platforms around the edges of the room to avoid the worst of the damp. Everyone, your entire family, and any unfortunate animals, sleeps in this one communal space. Privacy is a concept that hasn't really been invented yet, at least not for people of your standing. You huddle together for warmth, listening to the symphony of snores, coughs, animal snuffles, and the ever-present crackle of the dying fire. This single room is where everything happens. Food is cooked over the central fire in a single pot or cauldron, bubbling away with whatever grains and vegetables are available. Tools are mended by the firelight. Wool is spun using a simple drop spindle, and if you're fortunate enough to have a loom, it's likely an upright one, taking up valuable space where the women weave the coarse, itchy woolen cloth for your clothes. Children, when not engaged in chores suited to their small hands, might play quietly in a corner. Their toys, simple things, like carved wooden animals or smooth stones. Archaeological digs at sites like West Stow in Suffolk have unearthed fascinating evidence of these Anglo-Saxon buildings, including both the larger timber halls and the smaller sunken featured buildings often called Grubenhäuser by archaeologists. These reconstructions allow us to walk through spaces very much like the one you're currently enduring. Interestingly, there's some debate about those Grubenhäuser, the ones with the floors dug a foot or two into the ground. While some were undoubtedly used as dwellings, particularly in earlier periods, or by those lower down the social scale, many may have served other purposes. Some could have been workshops for weaving, the damp conditions allegedly being good for the wool, or for smithing, or simply as storehouses. You can almost picture one as an early form of man cave, but instead of a big screen TV, it's for weaving endless itchy wool, or perhaps hiding from the delightful aroma of your main living quarters. Historians still argue whether the sunken floors of Grubenhäuser were intended to provide extra warmth from the earth, create more headroom under a necessarily low roof, or if it was simply a practical construction technique suited to certain types of soil and the timber available. Whatever the academic debates, your reality is the smoky, cramped space you share with your family and sometimes your farm animals. It's drafty in winter, despite the central fire, with cold air seeping in through countless cracks in the walls and roof. In summer, it can become stiflingly hot and stuffy. The constant exposure to smoke undoubtedly leads to chronic respiratory problems. The lack of sanitation means diseases can spread like wildfire through a household or a village. It's a far cry from the comforts you're used to, a stark reminder that for much of human history, the concept of home sweet home was less about sweetness and more about basic, often uncomfortable shelter. You curl up on your straw bed, pulling your threadbare woolen cloak tighter around you, trying to ignore the itchiness, the smoky air, and the gentle grunting of the piglet nearby. Sleep comes eventually born more of sheer exhaustion than comfort. That sleep, born of sheer exhaustion, huddled on your straw pallet in the smoky darkness, is a fragile respite. You stir as a gray, uncertain light begins to seep through the cracks in the wall. But something feels off. A dull throb behind your eyes, a scratchiness in your throat that the ever-present smoke usually causes. But this feels deeper, more insistent. Your joints ache with a weariness that goes beyond the honest pain of a hard day's labor. Welcome to the Anglo-Saxon experience of being unwell, a state that is distressingly common in this world of constant hardship and rudimentary understanding of what makes a body sick. The very hovel you live in, remember, with its damp earth floor, shared animal tenancy, and questionable air quality, is a 5-star resort for germs and ailments. Respiratory problems are practically a given. That chronic cough you hear echoing through the village, that's just your neighbor and half the other inhabitants dealing with the effects of a lifetime breathing in wood smoke. Bronchitis pneumonia, or whatever contemporary term they use for a lung-filling fever, are frequent visitors, especially during the cold, damp winters. And speaking of fevers, they come in many delightful varieties. The ague, a recurring fever with chills and sweating, likely malaria, in the marshy fenlands can plague communities for generations. Then there are the less specific but equally debilitating fevers that sweep through settlements, perhaps typhoid or dysentery, especially when sanitation is, shall we say, aspirational. Contaminated water from the local stream or well, or food that's not been handled with the utmost care, can quickly lead to an outbreak that leaves many weakened or worse. You can forget your hand sanitizer and your food safety certifications. Here it's a daily gamble. Let's not forget the unwelcome guests that take up residence inside you. Parasitic worms, roundworms, tapeworms, the whole charming family, are incredibly common. You get them from poorly cooked meat, contaminated water, or just the general lack of separation between human and animal waste. The symptoms are often chronic stomach pains, malnutrition, general lethargy. It's just another layer of discomfort in an already uncomfortable existence. And on your skin, lice and fleas are your constant companions, an itchy reality of life when clothes are infrequently washed and bedding is well straw. Scabies, with its maddening rash, can also make the rounds. Your diet, so reliant on those coarse grains and whatever vegetables you can scavenge or grow, as we discussed often, lacks essential vitamins. Scurvy, with its bleeding gums and aching limbs, isn't just for sailors on long voyages. It can affect anyone whose winter diet is particularly devoid of fresh greens. Rickets, leading to softened bones, might also be seen in children despite the outdoor life. Generally, a poor diet means a weakened immune system, making you more susceptible to every passing bug. And your teeth, that gritty coarse bread, acts like sandpaper, wearing them down. Combined with a lack of anything resembling dental hygiene, abscesses are a common and excruciating problem. A swollen jaw and agonizing pain could easily lead to a systemic infection that proves fatal. There's no friendly dentist down the lane with a sterile drill and anesthetic. There's just stoic endurance, or perhaps a desperate attempt by someone to pull the offending tooth with a pair of unsterilized pliers. You can see why life expectancy figures from this period are so sobering. If you made it through the perilous first few years of childhood, and many, many didn't, you might, with luck, live into your 30s, or perhaps early 40s. An old person in their 50s or 60s would be a rarity, a figure of some awe, and probably a repository of much-needed experience. So what do you do when you're struck down by one of these numerous ills? Your understanding of what's actually causing your suffering is quite different from our modern medical view. Illness is often attributed to hostile supernatural forces. Perhaps you've been struck by elf shot, a sudden sharp pain believed to be caused by the invisible arrows of malicious elves. Or maybe it's the worm, not just the internal parasites we know. but a more metaphysical concept of a creature gnawing at your insides causing disease. Divine displeasure, a curse from an enemy, or the malevolent influence of witchcraft are all considered plausible explanations. There might be some lingering, hazy ideas from Roman medical texts about the balance of humors in the body, but it's far from a systematic science. Your local version of WebMD might be the village elder, who sagely nods and declares you're suffering from too many eels in your humors, or possibly a goblin in your gizzard. Given these beliefs, the treatments, or leechcraft, as it was known, are a fascinating and sometimes terrifying blend of the practical and the magical. Your local healer, or leech, a term derived from the Old English word for physician, not just the blood-sucking annelids, though they use those too, would employ a range of techniques. Herbal remedies are a cornerstone. The Leech Book of Bald, an incredible manuscript from around the 9th or 10th century, gives us a window into these practices. It's a compilation of recipes and charms for all sorts of ailments. Some of these herbal concoctions were genuinely effective. For instance, willow bark, often prescribed for aches and fevers, contains salicin, which is chemically similar to aspirin. In a remarkable modern scientific follow-up, a remedy from Bald's Leech Book for an eye infection, a sty, specifically involving garlic onion wine, and oxgall was recreated and tested. Amazingly, it was found to have potent antibiotic properties, effective even against the superbug MRSA. So not all of it was hocus pocus. However, alongside these potentially useful remedies, you'll find a heavy reliance on charms, amulets, and incantations. You might be given a specific chant to repeat while applying a poultice or an amulet made of certain materials to wear around your neck to ward off the disease-causing spirits. If you're suffering from elf shot, the treatment might involve a special salve, perhaps made with herbs gathered under a full moon, which has to be sung over with a particular charm and applied with a feather from a specific, hard-to-find bird. Your copay might be 3 sprigs of questionable lichen and a well-rehearsed magical verse. Bloodletting is also a popular all-purpose treatment believed to restore the balance of those pesky humors or release bad blood. Unfortunately, it often just weakened the patient further. If your condition requires something more invasive, then things get truly grim. Surgery is rudimentary, performed with basic tools and absolutely no concept of sterile conditions. Trepanning, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull, was performed. Historians still argue whether the Anglo-Saxons had a coherent medical system, or if healing practices were largely a fragmented collection of folk remedies, magical beliefs, and residual classical knowledge from Roman times. Perhaps trepanning was to release evil spirits, relieve pressure from a head wound, or for reasons we can't even guess. Amputation of a badly infected limb would be a desperate last-ditch effort with an incredibly high chance of death from shock blood loss or subsequent infection, anesthesia, maybe a strong dose of ale, or if you were incredibly lucky and your leech had access to it, something like henbane or poppy, to dull the senses, but you'd be very much aware of the horror unfolding. You'd pray the leech had a steady hand and a very sharp knife. The good news, your raging toothache is gone. The bad news, they took half your jaw with it, and you're not sure if that's a piece of lint or an old beetle in the wound. So as you lie there feeling the fever creep through your body, your options are limited. You send for the local leech, hoping their remedies are more of the sensible herbal kind than the purely magical, and pray that whatever unseen force has afflicted you decides to move on. The line between sickness and health, between life and death, is terrifyingly thin. That thin line between sickness and health, life and death, which you tread so carefully, also extends to your interactions with your fellow Anglo-Saxons. You've survived the fever perhaps, or managed to avoid the worst of the lung complaints for now. But what happens when another kind of misfortune strikes? What if your meager store of grain is stolen? Your prize pig wanders into a neighbor's field and gets injured, or heaven forbid, a kinsman is harmed or killed in a dispute. You can't just dial the local constabulary or summon a bewigged barrister. The mechanisms for justice here are a far more personal and often perilous affair. In the early days, especially, and lingering throughout the period as an undercurrent, the primary recourse for a serious wrong, particularly murder or grievous injury, is the blood feud. It's a stark concept, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. If someone from another family or kin group wrongs you or yours, it becomes your sacred duty, and that of your relatives, to seek vengeance. This isn't just an emotional outburst. It's a deeply embedded social obligation. Failure to act could bring shame upon your entire family. But you can imagine the problem. One act of vengeance often provokes a counter-vengeance, leading to escalating cycles of violence that can tear communities apart, sometimes for generations. It's like a really, really violent family reunion that just never ever ends, with each side bringing increasingly sharper party favors. To try and put a lid on these destructive feuds, a sophisticated system of compensation evolved known as vergild, literally man price. This is a cornerstone of Anglo-Saxon law. Essentially, every person, and indeed every part of a person, had a price. The law codes of Anglo-Saxon kings, like those of Ethelbert of Kent, way back in the early 7th century, or the more famous ones by Alfred the Great in the late 9th century, are remarkably detailed about this. They list the vergild for a king, an ealdorman, a high-ranking noble, a thegn warrior, aristocrat, and a ceorl, a free peasant like yourself. Unsurprisingly, a king's life is worth a king's ransom, while a ceorl's is considerably less. If you were a thrall, a slave, your vergild wasn't paid to your family but to your owner, as you were considered property. Even specific injuries had their set tariff, so much for a lost eye, a finger, a front tooth more valuable than a molar naturally, or even a broken rib. Your arm is worth 3 cows and a slightly used chicken. Deal. The idea was that if the offending party or their kin paid the appropriate vergild to the victim or their family, the matter could be considered settled and the blood feud averted. It was a way to channel retribution into a more structured, less chaotic path. But what if someone accuses you of a crime? Say your neighbor claims you stole his prized turnip, a turnip of legendary proportions apparently. Your first line of defense, especially if there are no direct witnesses, is the oath. You gather at the local moot, perhaps the 100 moot, a regular assembly for a district of roughly 100 hides of land, or the shire moot, a larger assembly for the whole shire, presided over by the ealdorman and the shire reeve, the king's local official. Here in front of the community, you solemnly swear your innocence on sacred relics, invoking God as your witness. But your word alone often isn't enough. You need oath helpers, or compurgators. These are reputable members of your community, usually kinsmen or neighbors of good standing, who are willing to swear, not that they know you're innocent, but that they believe your oath is true. and that you are a person of good character. The number and status of oath helpers required would depend on the seriousness of the accusation and your own social rank. If you can't find enough people willing to stand for you, or if your accuser can muster more or more credible oath helpers, things start to look rather bleak. If the matter can't be resolved by oaths, or if the crime is too serious, you might face the ordeal. This is where things get truly terrifying, as it's essentially an appeal to God to reveal the truth through a physical test. The theory is that God will protect the innocent from harm. There were several charming options. The ordeal of hot iron involved you carrying a red-hot bar of iron weighing perhaps 1 to 3 pounds for a set number of paces. Afterwards, your hand would be bound and sealed by the presiding priest. 3 days later, the bandage is removed. If the wound is healing cleanly, congratulations, God has proclaimed your innocence. If it's festering and infected, well, it's not looking good for you. You're guilty. Similarly, there was the ordeal of hot water, where you'd have to plunge your arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. Same inspection process, same delightful consequences. Then there's the ordeal of cold water. You'd be bound thumb to opposite big toe usually, and then lowered into a body of water that had been blessed by a priest. If you sank, the pure water was deemed to have accepted you. You were innocent, and hopefully pulled out before you drowned, though that wasn't always guaranteed. If you floated, however, the holy water had rejected you, you were guilty. Because obviously, guilty people are more buoyant due to all their sin-filled air pockets. It's science Anglo-Saxon style. Historians still argue whether the ordeal was genuinely believed to be an infallible judgment of God, or if it was a more calculated psychological tool used by authorities and priests to extract confessions, encourage settlements, or simply to provide a definitive, albeit terrifying, resolution in intractable cases. Whatever the underlying rationale for you standing there, about to have your flesh seared, or be dunked into a freezing pond, it's a moment of profound dread. The laws of the time, as recorded in various codes, also dealt with a host of other transgressions. Some are surprisingly specific, almost quirky. You might find fines for brawling in someone's house, with the amount varying, depending on whether ale was being served or if weapons were drawn. There were rules about stray cattle, about slander, about the proper maintenance of fences. Perhaps there was even a fine for improperly tethering your dragon, though that one might be a slight embellishment. The point is, they were trying to create a framework for social order in a world that could easily descend into chaos. If the weregild isn't paid, or if you're found guilty through oath or ordeal for a serious crime, the punishments can be severe. For many offenses, it's fines, the payment of compensation. But for others, it could be mutilation. The loss of a hand for persistent theft, for example, or branding. For the most serious crimes, like treason or murder, where weregild is refused, or impossible execution by hanging or beheading, is the ultimate sanction. Another grim fate is outlawry. If declared an outlaw, you are stripped of all legal protection. Anyone can kill you without penalty, and your property is forfeit. You become a wolf's head, hunted and shunned. So as you navigate your life, you're not just worried about disease or starvation. You're also enmeshed in a complex web of social obligations and potential legal perils. A careless word, a dispute over land, an accidental injury caused to another. Any of these could plunge you and your kin into a dangerous situation. Justice is a raw, immediate force, and its instruments are often brutal. You learn to tread carefully to guard your reputation and to hope that your oath helpers are numerous and loyal. You learn to tread carefully in your dealings with neighbors, to guard your reputation and to keep your oath helpers close, because the local justice system, as we've seen, can be a brutal and unpredictable beast. But even if you manage to navigate the complexities of feuds and weregild, there's a larger, often more indiscriminate threat that looms over your existence warfare. The constant fear of raids, or the summons to join the Fyrd and march off to fight some distant king's battle, is another layer of anxiety in your already challenging life. Peace is a fragile commodity in Anglo-Saxon England, easily shattered by the ambitions of rulers or the predatory hunger of raiders. For much of this era, the land you call England isn't a single unified kingdom. It's a patchwork of competing territories: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, and others, whose kings and warlords are often engaged in a perpetual grumbling squabble for dominance. Your local lord might decide that the king of the neighboring territory looked at him funny during the last feast, or perhaps there's a dispute over a particularly fertile stretch of land, or just a general desire for more power and prestige. And just like that, you as a sea earl, a freeman, might find yourself called up for the Fyrd. This is the Anglo-Saxon army, essentially a levy of able-bodied men, obligated to provide military service. You're expected to turn up with your own weapons, if you can afford them, and enough provisions to last for the campaign, usually a set period like 40 days. It's less a professional standing army and more of a bring-your-own-spear kind of party. So what are you arming yourself with? Don't picture gleaming plate armor and a perfectly balanced longsword unless you're a very wealthy thane or a member of the king's personal retinue. For you, the common Fyrdman, the spear is your primary weapon. It's relatively cheap to produce, versatile, good for thrusting and even throwing, and effective when used in formation. You might also have a seax, a long single-edged knife that serves as both a tool and a close combat weapon. An axe is another possibility, either a hefty fighting axe or a smaller throwing axe. Swords. They are high-status items, expensive to make symbols of wealth and warrior prowess. If you own one, you're doing pretty well. Bows and arrows are certainly used for hunting and in warfare, but the real crunch of an Anglo-Saxon battle often comes down to men standing face-to-face or shield-to-shield. As for protection, your main defense is your shield. It's typically round, made of wood, often lime wood, which is light but strong, perhaps covered with leather, and with an iron boss in the center to protect your hand. It's not a massive body covering affair, more like a significantly more robust dinner plate on a stick designed for deflecting blows and being maneuverable. A helmet, if you have one, is likely a simple conical design, perhaps with a nasal bar to protect your nose, but many in the Fyrd would go into battle with nothing more than a thick woolen cap or a leather helmet, if that. Mail armor, those intricate shirts of interlinked iron rings, called burnies, are incredibly labor-intensive to make and thus very expensive, strictly for the elite. So you're standing there with your spear and shield feeling rather exposed. The iconic Anglo-Saxon battle tactic is the shield wall, or schildbur. Imagine ranks of men standing shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping, creating a solid barrier of wood and iron. It's a defensive formation designed to withstand enemy charges and arrow volleys. But it can also advance, albeit slowly pushing against an opposing shield wall in a brutal grinding contest of strength and nerve. The noise alone must have been terrifying. The rhythmic thudding of weapons on shields, The war cries and taunts, the blast of war horns, and then, as the lines engage, the screams of the wounded. It's close quarters savage fighting. There's no room for fancy footwork or elaborate dueling. It's about stabbing, hacking, and trying to break the enemy's formation to create a gap you can exploit. And then there are the raids. From the late 8th century onwards, a new and terrifying threat begins to appear on the horizon: the Vikings. Their long ships, shallow-drafted and swift, can penetrate far inland up rivers, striking with terrifying speed and brutality. Coastal settlements, monasteries which were often wealthy and poorly defended, and isolated farmsteads are all prime targets. For you living in a small village, the first sign of trouble might be the distant sight of smoke or the panicked ringing of a church bell, if you're lucky enough to have one that serves as an alarm. The raiders are after plunder, gold, silver, livestock, food, and slaves. To be captured in a raid means a grim future, either being worked to death or sold off in some distant market. The fear of such an attack is a constant gnawing presence, especially if you live anywhere near the coast or a navigable river. The sheer terror of facing a band of battle-hardened Vikings, or even just a rival Anglo-Saxon warband, is hard to overstate. These aren't skirmishes with agreed-upon rules of engagement. Wounded enemies are often dispatched without a second thought. The aftermath of a battle or a successful raid is a scene of devastation. Homes looted and burned, livestock driven off or slaughtered, the dead left unburied, and the survivors facing starvation or enslavement. The famous Battle of Maldon, fought in 991 AD between an Anglo-Saxon force and Viking raiders, is immortalized in an Old English poem. While it undoubtedly glorifies the heroism and loyalty of the Anglo-Saxon warriors, it also gives a stark glimpse into the brutal realities of combat and the dire consequences of defeat. Some warriors, particularly the nobles and seasoned fighters, took great pride in their weapons. A fine sword wasn't just a piece of steel. It was a treasured heirloom, perhaps even given a name like Blood Drinker or Skull Splitter, or my personal favorite, Stabby McStabface, passed down from my great-great-grand stabber. These weapons might be intricately decorated with inlaid patterns or runes, symbols of the owner's status and martial prowess. Such a sword might even be believed to possess its own spirit or luck. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for the Viking raids that so terrorized Anglo-Saxon England was purely economic gain, the desire for portable wealth, and slaves a pressing shortage of good agricultural land back in Scandinavia, internal political instability driving young warriors to seek fortune overseas, or a more complex interplay of all these factors. For you, though, the academic debates offer little comfort when the war horn sounds or the cry goes up that raiders are approaching. Your heart hammers in your chest, your mouth goes dry. You grab your spear, check the straps on your shield, and say a silent prayer to whatever gods or saints you hold dear. Whether you're marching out with the Fyrd to defend your kingdom's borders or huddling with your family, hoping the storm passes your village by the ever-present threat of war, casts a long, dark shadow over your life. It's a reminder that survival isn't just about battling the elements or disease. It's also about enduring the violence that humans inflict upon one another. The glint of sun on distant steel, the smell of fear mixed with the metallic tang of blood, the desperate hope that you'll see another sunrise. These are the unwelcome accompaniments to life in an age of conflict. The ever-present threat of war, the summons to the Fyrd, the brutal shield wall. These experiences are shaped not just by the enemy you face, but also by who you are within Anglo-Saxon society. Your chances of survival, the quality of your weapons and armor, even where you stand in that desperate line of battle, are heavily influenced by your social standing. Life in Anglo-Saxon England isn't just a struggle against the elements or external foes. It's also lived within a fairly rigid hierarchy, a social ladder where the rungs are often fixed at birth, and the view from the bottom is considerably less appealing than the view from the top. It's a world of lords and thralls, of unfair shares and largely predetermined fates. At the very peak of this pyramid, you have the sinning the king. He's the chief warlord, the primary lawgiver, though always in consultation with his leading men, his witan, or council, and in theory, the protector of his people. His authority isn't absolute in the way a later medieval monarch's might be. It relies heavily on his ability to reward his followers, his success in battle, his lineage. He usually comes from a royal family, an Etheling, and the continued loyalty of the powerful nobles beneath him. A weak or unlucky king could find his support, and indeed his kingdom, melting away like spring snow. Beneath the king are the nobles. The highest rank belong to the ealdormen, powerful magnates who govern large territories or shires on the king's behalf. They lead their local fyrds, preside over shire courts, and are major players in the kingdom's politics. Then you have the thanes, a class of warrior aristocrats who are the backbone of the king's fighting force. Think of them as middle management, but with significantly more swords and far fewer passive-aggressive emails. A thegn typically holds land, often a substantial estate of 5 hides or more, directly from the king, or an ealdorman, and in return, he owes military service counsel and loyalty. He's expected to have his own weapons, including a mail-shirt byrnie helmet and sword, and to lead his own contingent of warriors into battle. His haul will be larger, his diet richer, his influence far greater than yours. Then there's you, most likely a choral. You are a freeman, the sturdy peasant farmer we've encountered before, forming the great majority of the population. You might own your own plot of land, your hide. Notionally, the amount of land needed to support one family, or you might rent land from a lord. You have rights under the law. Your Verguild is set, you can bear witness in court, and you have a voice in the local assembly. But you also have significant obligations. You owe service in the fyrd, you provide food rent, the fjorm, to your lord from your produce, and you might have to perform other labor services on his estate. While free, your freedom can feel quite constrained by these duties and by your economic circumstances. One bad harvest, one heavy fine could push you towards a less enviable status. Below the seorls, or perhaps alongside them, in a slightly more dependent position, are other categories of peasants like the geburas or kotsetlas. These individuals often have smaller land holdings and heavier labor obligations to their lord, effectively tied to the estate they work on. Their level of freedom is more ambiguous, hovering somewhere between the seorl and the unfree. And at the very bottom of this social ladder, you find the thralls, or slaves. This is a significant portion of the population, perhaps 10 to 30% in some areas, though historians still argue whether the Anglo-Saxon economy was primarily a gift economy driven by reciprocal obligations between lords and followers, or if market forces and commercial exchange, including the trade in thralls, played a more significant role, especially in later periods. You can become a thrall in several ways: born into it, If your mother was a thrall captured in war, many Welsh and Irish became thralls this way, as did Anglo-Saxons captured by rival kingdoms or Vikings, or through debt, or as a punishment for certain crimes. As a thrall, you are not a person in the eyes of the law. You are property like an ox or a plow. You can be bought and sold, beaten, or even killed by your owner, with few, if any, legal repercussions for them. Your life is one of endless toil. Hard agricultural labor, domestic service, whatever your master or mistress demands. No dental plan, no paid vacation, just the grind of work, minimal food and shelter, just enough to keep you productive, and the constant awareness of your utter powerlessness. Social mobility. It's not exactly fluid. Your birth largely dictates your path in life. It is theoretically possible for a particularly successful and wealthy seoral to rise to the rank of thegn. Some law codes mention that if a coral acquired 5 hides of land, a helmet, a mail shirt, and a sword, and performed special service for the king, he could attain thenly status. But this would have been an exceptional achievement requiring immense good fortune and ability. It's far easier to fall down the ladder. A coral falling into debt could be forced to sell his land and eventually himself or his children into thraldom to survive. A famine or a devastating raid could strip a family of its resources, leaving them vulnerable. The daily life of these different social strata varies immensely. The king and his ealdormen live in large timber halls, feasting regularly with their retinues of thegns, drinking ale and mead from fine glassware or silver-mounted horns, listening to poets recite tales of heroes and battles. They hunt in their private forests, practice their martial skills, and engage in the high-stakes game of politics. Their clothing is finer dyed in richer colors, adorned with jewelry of gold, silver, and garnet. You, the seoral, live in your smoky hovel, your days filled with the agricultural rhythms we've already explored, your diet simple, your clothes coarse and undyed wool or linen. Your joys are simpler, your horizons narrower. The thrall's existence is even starker. You might sleep on the floor of your owner's hall, or in a rough outbuilding rise before dawn to begin your tasks and work until exhaustion claims you all under the watchful eye of an overseer. There's little hope for change, little control over your own destiny. There are, however, occasional glimmers. Sometimes a thrall could be granted their freedom, a process called manumission. This might happen as a reward for long and faithful service, or it could be stipulated in a lord's will, perhaps, as an act of piety. Interestingly, these acts of freeing slaves were sometimes recorded in the margins of important religious manuscripts, like gospel books, with the church acting as a public witness to the individual's new status. Imagine your freedom certificate being scribbled in alongside the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And also, just FYI, Thorgils, son of Leofstan, is now a free man, so don't go trying to enslave him again. It's a quirky testament to the preciousness of liberty in a world where it was so easily denied. But for most, the station you are born into is the station you will die in. The system is designed to maintain stability, to ensure that everyone knows their place and performs their designated role, from the king on his high seat to the lowest thrall toiling in the fields. It's a world of deeply ingrained inequality, where the unfair shares are not a bug in the system, but a fundamental feature of it. The station you're born into, be it then or thrall king or coral, largely dictates your material fortunes and your social obligations. But this rigid earthly hierarchy is just one part of the framework that shapes your understanding of life and your place within it. Your entire worldview, your perception of cause and effect, fortune and misfortune is deeply interwoven with a complex tapestry of gods, spirits, ancient superstitions, and the slow, steady, and sometimes confusing creep of a new faith Christianity. These beliefs aren't just abstract theological concepts. They are immediate practical forces that influence your daily actions and color your every experience. In the earlier centuries of Anglo-Saxon England, before the Christian missionaries gained a strong foothold, your spiritual landscape is populated by a pantheon of robust, rather earthy deities. You might offer your prayers and perhaps a sacrifice to Woden the Allfather, a god of wisdom, magic, poetry, war, and death, a somewhat Odin-like figure, and the reason we call the middle of our week Wednesday or Woden's Day. Then there's Thunor, the mighty thunder god, wielder of a great hammer protector of mankind, whose name thunders on in our Thursday. Tiw, a god of war and justice, gives us Tuesday, and Frigg, a powerful goddess associated with love, fertility, and the household, lends her name to Friday. These aren't distant, aloof beings. They are believed to intervene directly in the affairs of mortals, their favor sought, for good harvests, victory in battle, or healthy children. Your religious practice isn't confined to temples. Though some sacred enclosures or simple wooden shrines might exist, it's often enacted in nature itself. Certain groves of ancient trees, particular wells or springs, prominent rocks or hills, these can all be seen as sacred places imbued with spiritual power, homes to local deities or nature spirits, the land wights or water spirits. You approach these places with respect, perhaps leaving small offerings, a bit of food, a libation of ale, a handcrafted trinket, to keep the local spirits happy and ensure their continued goodwill. After all, you wouldn't want to offend the spirit of the stream that waters your fields, would you? The consequences could be dire. Animal sacrifice, particularly of horses or cattle, might also be part of larger communal rituals at specific times of the year, like Yule in midwinter or Eostre in the spring. Festivals whose names and some traditions will later be absorbed and transformed by Christianity. Alongside these greater gods and nature spirits, your daily life is saturated with folk magic and a host of superstitions. You wear amulets, a boar-shaped charm for protection in battle, a smooth stone found by a sacred well for good luck, or perhaps a piece of amber to ward off illness. You know specific charms and incantations passed down through your family, or learned from a local cunning man or wise woman. These might be spoken over herbs to enhance their healing properties. Remember our friend Bald's leech book, chanted during sowing to ensure a good crop, or muttered as you bar your door at night to keep out malevolent influences. You believe in elves, often seen as capricious and sometimes dangerous beings, capable of causing sudden illness or misfortune with their invisible elf shot. Goblins, dwarves, giants, and even monstrous creatures lurking in the fens and marshes, like the Grendel of later epic poetry, are all part of your accepted reality. You learn to read omens in the flight of birds, a raven flying widdershins counterclockwise. Oh, that's definitely 3 days of bad porridge, and a strong possibility your cow will give sour milk. The howling of a dog at a certain time, the shape of the clouds, a dream you had last night. All could be portents, messages from the unseen world that you ignore at your peril. Into this world, starting in 597 AD with the arrival of Augustine's mission in Kent. Sent by Pope Gregory, the great Christianity begins to spread. This isn't an overnight transformation. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon England is a gradual, often complex process that takes centuries. Typically, a king converts, first influenced perhaps by a Christian wife, by the example of a neighboring Christian kingdom, or by the perceived power and prestige of the Christian God, especially if he seems to grant military victories. Once the king converts his nobles, and then the general populace are encouraged, sometimes pressured, to follow suit. But it's not always a straightforward replacement of one belief system with another. Often there's a period of syncretism, a blending of the old and the new. People might hedge their bets. Sure, you go to the new wooden church on a Sunday and listen to the priest talk about the one God and his Son Jesus Christ, but on your way home, you might still discreetly leave that offering for the field spirits just in case. Old pagan sacred sites are sometimes rededicated. A sacred spring might now be associated with a Christian saint. Pagan festivals find echoes in the Christian calendar. Yule's feasting and evergreens become part of Christmas. The spring festival of Eostre, named for a goddess of dawn or spring, lends its name and some of its symbolism, like eggs and rabbit symbols, of fertility to Easter. Even some magical practices, get a Christian gloss charms, might now invoke the Trinity or the names of saints instead of or alongside the old gods. One quirky aspect of this folk magic is the belief in sympathetic magic. For instance, if you have a painful swelling, a healer might tie a knotted cord around it while chanting, then later untie the knots to symbolically release the swelling. Or they might try to transfer your toothache to a nail, which is then hammered into a tree. It's like trying to give your OE a new home. The new Christian faith brings with it profound changes to your worldview. The idea of a single, all-powerful, all-knowing God, the creator of heaven and earth, is a very different concept from the often quarrelsome and flawed pagan deities. Concepts of sin, repentance, salvation through Christ, and a clearly defined afterlife in either heaven or hell offer a new moral and eschatological framework. Written texts, the Bible, the lives of saints' theological commentaries, become immensely important, and monasteries like those at Canterbury Lindisfarne or Jarrow emerge as centers of learning, literacy, wealth, and considerable political power. Priests and bishops become influential figures in society, not just spiritual guides, but also advisors to kings and administrators of growing church estates. Even so, for a long time, the old ways linger. You might find yourself living in a community where some openly cling to pagan practices. Others are devout Christians, and many like yourself exist in a kind of spiritual gray area. Historians still argue about the extent to which the conversion to Christianity truly eradicated pagan beliefs among the general populace, or whether paganism simply went underground, subtly influencing folk practices, superstitions, and even local interpretations of Christianity for centuries to come. So, while you might learn the Lord's Prayer and attend Mass, you probably still feel a shiver of unease when walking past that ancient burial mound after sunset, and you might just cross your fingers and whisper an old protective charm when you hear a strange noise in the night. Your world is alive with unseen forces, a mixture of divine order and older, wilder magic, and navigating it requires both faith and a healthy dose of cautious superstition. Your understanding of the world shot through with a belief in powerful gods, mischievous spirits, and the overarching narrative of a new Christian faith naturally extends to how you perceive the most vulnerable members of your society, your children. Life, as we've seen, is precarious enough for an adult in Anglo-Saxon England. For a child, it is a journey fraught with peril from the very first breath, and the concept of a carefree childhood filled with play and protected innocence is a luxury few can afford. Childhood here is less a distinct, cherished phase and more a swift apprenticeship for the harsh realities of adult life, a period where labor often begins as soon as little hands are capable of a task. The very act of being born is a dangerous business for both you as the mother and your infant. There are no sterile hospitals, no obstetricians on call. Childbirth happens in your smoky hovel, likely attended by a local midwife or experienced older women from the community. Their knowledge is a mixture of practical experience passed down through generations, herbal remedies, remember those charms and potions from Bald's Leech Book, and prayers or incantations to ward off evil spirits or ensure a safe delivery. But complications are common, and many mothers and babies do not survive the ordeal. If your baby does arrive safely, a wave of relief and perhaps a quick prayer of thanks to whichever divine power you currently favor washes over you. Names are chosen with care, often honoring ancestors or respected figures, a way of weaving the new life into the existing tapestry of kinship and community. The first year is a critical test. Infant mortality rates are heartbreakingly high. Diseases that might be minor inconveniences today, a common cold, a bout of diarrhea, can easily prove fatal to a tiny, vulnerable body with an undeveloped immune system, especially in the unsanitary conditions of your home. Malnutrition, even if not severe enough to kill an adult, can weaken an infant significantly. Accidents are another constant threat. An open hearth fire, unsecured tools, an unwary step near the family pig who might not appreciate tiny prodding fingers. Archaeological evidence from Anglo-Saxon cemeteries starkly tells this story. The number of infant and child burials is a sobering reminder of how many young lives were cut short. Sometimes growth arrest lines found in the bones of those who did survive indicate periods of severe illness or famine during their early years. If your child makes it through these perilous early stages, their toddler years are less about peekaboo and more about pick-a-weed. There's little time or cultural inclination for the sentimentalization of childhood that we see in later periods. Children are in essence small adults in training. As soon as they can walk and understand simple instructions, they begin to contribute to the household economy. Your career path effectively starts around age 7, or even earlier, perhaps fetching slightly less murky water from the stream, gathering firewood, or scaring birds away from the precious crops in the fields. Child labor laws are, shall we say, a few centuries off schedule. Tasks are often, though not exclusively, divided along gender lines, mirroring the adult roles they will soon fully inhabit. Little boys might be sent out to watch over the smaller livestock, the pigs grubbing in the woods, the sheep or goats grazing on common land. They learn to handle animals, to recognize edible plants from poisonous ones, and to navigate the local landscape. As they grow stronger, they'll help their fathers with plowing, sowing, and harvesting, learning the rhythms of the agricultural year. They'll also learn to use and care for tools, and perhaps as they approach adolescence, the basics of wielding a spear or axe in preparation for eventual feared duty. Little girls, meanwhile, are kept closer to home, assisting their mothers with the endless domestic chores. They'll learn to grind grain on the heavy quernstones, to tend the fire, to help with cooking the family's meager meals. A significant portion of their time will be spent on textile production. carding wool, spinning it into thread with a drop spindle, a skill requiring considerable dexterity, and eventually learning to weave that thread into the coarse cloth needed for clothing and blankets on the upright loom. They also help with weeding the small vegetable patches, looking after younger siblings, and keeping the hovel as clean as circumstances allow. Does this mean there's no room for play? Of course not. Children are children after all. But play is likely to be simple, often intertwined with learning practical skills or imitating adult activities. Toys might be a roughly carved wooden animal, a smooth collection of stones, a rag doll, or just a good stick that can be a horse, a sword, or a tool, depending on the game. They might play chasing games, tell each other stories, or mimic the rituals and work they see around them. Some of the Anglo-Saxon riddles found in manuscripts like the Exeter Book, with their playful descriptions and hidden meanings, seem suited to a youthful mind, suggesting a space for imagination and verbal dexterity. One of my favorites goes something like, "I have a neck without a head, a body without legs. I'll tell you no lies, I make many men wise." The answer: a book. Though chances are you and your children wouldn't be able to read it, as formal education is a rarity. Literacy is largely confined to the clergy, and perhaps some of the higher nobility. If a boy shows particular aptitude, or if his family wishes to dedicate him to the church, he might be sent to a monastery as an oblate, to learn Latin, to read and write, and to study religious texts. Some noble households might employ a priest as a tutor for their children. But for the vast majority like yourself, education is entirely informal. Learning by watching, listening, and doing. Skills are passed directly from parent to child, and the rich oral tradition of stories, songs, poems, and proverbs is the primary means of transmitting cultural values, history, and practical wisdom. Historians still argue about the emotional bonds within Anglo-Saxon families and how the appallingly high rates of child mortality might have affected parental attachment and attitudes towards children. Did parents invest less emotionally in offspring who had such a high chance of dying young? Or did the constant presence of death make those bonds even more precious, albeit tinged with a pervasive anxiety? It's hard to say with certainty from this distance. Love and affection undoubtedly existed, but they were perhaps expressed in more pragmatic ways, focused on ensuring survival and teaching the skills necessary for a hard life. There was little room for coddling. Resilience was a virtue instilled from a very young age. You would have seen many children in your community sicken and die, perhaps even your own siblings or offspring, and this constant proximity to loss would inevitably shape your emotional landscape. By their early teens, if they've survived the gauntlet of disease and accident, your children are essentially young adults. The transition is swift. Girls might be married off in their mid-teens, their childbearing years beginning almost immediately. Boys are taking on the full workload of men, contributing significantly to the farm's output, or perhaps starting to learn a specialized craft if one is available in your village. Childhood, in the sense of a protected period of development, is fleeting quickly, giving way to the burdens and responsibilities of a world that demands much and offers little in the way of gentle nurturing. Childhood, as you've experienced it, is largely confined to the familiar sights, sounds, and smells of your own village and its immediate surroundings. The fields you help to cultivate, the patch of woodland where you gather firewood, the stream where you fetch water. Your world is small, its horizons close. And in many ways, this limited personal geography reflects the broader reality. For most people in Anglo-Saxon England, life is intensely local, and communities are often cut off from one another by the sheer difficulty and danger of travel. Venturing beyond your own small patch of earth is not something undertaken lightly. Of course, people do travel, but it's often out of necessity rather than for leisure. Perhaps there's a local market a day's walk away where you can trade a small surplus of grain for a bit of precious salt or an iron tool. Maybe your lord requires you to deliver goods to his main hall, or a thegn is summoned to the king's court involving a journey of many days. Religious faith might compel you on a pilgrimage to a notable shrine, or a holy, while seeking a cure for an ailment, or offering thanks for good fortune. And as we know, the feared summons means you'll be marching often long distances to confront some distant enemy. Sometimes sheer desperation, famine warfare, or the loss of your land might force you and your family to seek a new life elsewhere, becoming migrants in a land that doesn't always welcome strangers. And of course, there are visits to kin who might live in a neighboring village or a valley or two away, journeys that reconnect family ties, but are still significant undertakings. For most ordinary folk like yourself, the primary mode of transport is your own 2 feet. You walk, and walk, and walk, through mud, over rough ground, across wind-swept heathland. Your footwear, if you have any, is likely simple leather turn shoes, not exactly designed for comfort on a long trek. Your Fitbit were such a fantastical device to exist, would probably just give up after the first few days and declare you a minor deity of perambulation. Wealthier individuals, nobles, prosperous merchants, important churchmen might travel on horseback. Horses are faster, certainly, but they are valuable animals, requiring fodder and care, and not something the average curel possesses solely for transport. Goods, if they need to be moved in any quantity, are loaded onto slow, cumbersome carts or wagons usually pulled by plodding oxen. These are agonizingly slow and entirely at the mercy of the terrain. And the terrain, oh, the terrain. Those famous straight Roman roads, marvels of engineering in their day, are by now often in a sorry state of disrepair. Some stretches might still be usable, but many are overgrown, their stones pilfered for building their foundations, sinking into boggy ground. Beyond these remnants, you're dealing with local tracks that are little more than churned mud in wet weather and deeply rutted dust bowls in dry spells. Bridges are a rarity. Rivers are often crossed at fords, shallow points where you can wade or guide a cart through. But a sudden rainstorm upstream can turn a placid ford into a raging impassable torrent, or worse, a deadly trap. Trying to navigate this landscape with any kind of map is a distant dream. Google Maps in this era would probably just show a vast expanse of green and brown with a single unhelpful label. Here be dragons, and also good luck with that swamp. The physical challenges are only part of the problem. The roads, such as they are, can be dangerous places. Remember those outlaws? We talked about the wolf's heads, living outside the protection of the law. The dense forests and unpopulated wildernesses offer them perfect cover to ambush unwary travelers. You'd be wise to travel in a group, if possible, for mutual protection. Wild animals are another concern. While perhaps not lurking behind every tree, wolves are a genuine threat, especially if you're traveling alone or at dusk through forested areas. Then there's the simple danger of getting lost. With few landmarks that a stranger would recognize and a distinct lack of helpful signposts, it's easy to take a wrong turn and wander for days in an unfamiliar territory. You rely on local knowledge if you can find someone trustworthy to ask, or perhaps hire a guide if you're on important business and can afford it. And what about when night falls? Or when a biting wind and sleeting rain make further progress impossible? There are no convenient roadside motels with heated rooms and a complimentary breakfast. You might be lucky enough to reach a monastery, as many of them offered hospitality to pilgrims and other travelers, providing a simple meal and a place to sleep on the floor of a guest house. Or perhaps you know someone in a village along your route who will offer you shelter by their fire. But often, you're sleeping rough, huddled under a makeshift lean-to of branches wrapped in your cloak beneath the stars, which admittedly would be incredibly bright without modern light pollution. Or if you're fortunate, in an abandoned shepherd's hut. Exposure to the elements is a constant risk. A journey undertaken in fair weather can quickly turn perilous if the conditions change. This difficulty and danger of travel has a profound impact on the fabric of Anglo-Saxon society. Communities tend to be remarkably isolated. Your village might be largely self-sufficient, producing most of what it needs to survive, because regular trade in anything beyond essential local exchanges is just too difficult. News from the outside world travels slowly, if at all. The death of a king, a major battle fought a few shires away, the arrival of new raiders on a distant coast. This information might take days, weeks, or even months to filter through to your remote settlement, passed along by word of mouth from one traveler to another. There's no instant messaging, no rolling news channels, just eventually messaging if you're lucky. This isolation also fosters strong local identities. Dialects can change noticeably from one valley to the next. Customs, traditions, even interpretations of folk tales or religious practices can vary significantly over relatively short geographical distances. Despite these immense challenges, trade and travel did occur. The re-emergence and growth of trading centers known as wicks, places like Londonwick, London, Hamwick near modern Southampton, Gypswick, Ipswich, and Eoforwick, York, during the Middle Saxon period, roughly 650 to 850 AD, clearly indicates that goods were being moved not just locally, but sometimes over considerable distances, even internationally. Salt from coastal pans, iron blooms from smelting sites, pottery textiles, and for the elite luxury items like wine, glassware, and jewelry from the continent. These things found their way along the hazardous routes. Some Anglo-Saxon charters and law codes even mention the trinoda necessitas, a threefold obligation on landowners, which included fyrd service, which we've discussed, fortress work, maintaining local fortifications, and crucially bridge work, highlighting the societal recognition of the need for and the burden of maintaining basic travel infrastructure. Still, historians still argue about the actual volume and regularity of long-distance trade and travel undertaken by ordinary Anglo-Saxons, as opposed to the wealthy elite or specialized merchants who might have had the resources and incentives to brave the perils of the road more frequently. For you, the average Seoral, your world likely remains bounded by how far you can comfortably walk in a day or two. The thought of a journey to a place like Rome, which some devout and usually wealthy pilgrims did undertake, would be as outlandish as a trip to the moon. Your life is lived within the rhythms of your local landscape, your connections strongest with those you see and interact with every day. The wider world, a distant, often rumor-filled unknown. Your world largely confined to the small circle of your village, and the occasional perilous journey beyond it is a testament to how much the untamed wilderness still dictates the terms of life. That isolation we just talked about isn't just a matter of poor roads or the fear of bandits. It's profoundly shaped by the very character of the land itself. Nature in Anglo-Saxon England is not a gently curated park or a picturesque backdrop for a weekend hike. It is a vast, powerful, and often unforgiving force, an omnipresent entity that provides sustenance, but also poses constant threats to your survival. Even within the relative safety of your settlement, you are never truly free from nature's often harsh and unpredictable hand. Step outside your village clearing, and you are immediately confronted by the wildwood. We've touched on the forests before, but it's hard to overstate their dominance in the landscape. These aren't managed commercial forests. They are sprawling, ancient woodlands, dark and dense, where sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor. They are a source of vital resources, of course: timber for your homes, and tools firewood to keep the cold at bay, nuts and berries for foraging, and game for your lord's table, and for yours, if you're brave or foolish enough to risk poaching. But they are also places of deep shadow and mystery, home to wolves, wild boar, and perhaps in your imagination, at least less natural beings. Getting lost in such a place is terrifyingly easy. The sheer scale of it can feel oppressive. Pollen analysis and archaeological studies confirm that while the Anglo-Saxons were actively clearing land for agriculture, vast tracts of this wildwood still covered the countryside, a constant reminder of nature's raw power. Then there are the fens and marshes, particularly extensive in areas like East Anglia. Picture a seemingly endless expanse of reed beds, stagnant pools, and treacherous boggy ground where a misstep can see you sink to your knees or worse. These are damp, misty places, breeding grounds for clouds of biting insects in the summer and the source of the ague, those recurring fevers we spoke of, likely malaria, that can debilitate entire communities. Yet, like the forests, they also offer resources: reeds for thatching your roof, wildfowl, and fish for the pot if you have the skill to catch them. Further afield, you might encounter barren, windswept heathlands or bleak moorlands, difficult to cultivate and offering little shelter from the elements. And always there is the sea if you live near the coast, a provider of fish and a highway for trade, but also the bringer of devastating storms, coastal erosion that can reclaim precious land, and the ever-present threat of those seaborne raiders. But perhaps the most relentless natural adversary is the weather. It's not just a topic for small talk. It's a matter of life and death. You live under a sky that often seems to weep. That persistent drizzle we joked about earlier, the driving rain that can last for days, the clinging fogs, they don't just make you miserable. They can ruin harvests, leading to the grim specter of famine. They turn your fields into quagmires, make travel nearly impossible, and contribute to the dampness in your hovel that encourages sickness. The weather forecast for any given day is basically you poking your head out of your hut, looking at the sky, and probably sighing. There's no app to warn you of an impending downpour or a sudden frost. And the cold. Winters can be brutal. Long nights, short days, and biting frosts that freeze the ground solid. Your poorly heated, drafty hovel offers minimal protection. Livestock huddled in byres or even brought into your home can succumb to the cold or to starvation if fodder runs out. Stored food supplies dwindle, and the hunger months before the spring thaw and the first new growth become a desperate waiting game. Conversely, a prolonged drought in summer, while perhaps less common in the generally damp climate of Britain than in other parts of the world, could be equally catastrophic, withering crops in the fields and drying up water sources. Violent storms are another terror. Thunder and lightning might be seen as manifestations of Thunder's power, or later God's wrath, inspiring awe and fear. Gale-force winds can rip the thatch from your roof, or fell mighty trees, and torrential rain can lead to flash floods. Historians still argue about the precise impact of climatic fluctuations during the Anglo-Saxon period, such as the gradual shift towards the medieval warm period towards the end of this era, or earlier colder, wetter spells, on agricultural output, settlement patterns, and overall living conditions. But for you on the ground, it's the immediate unpredictable nature of the weather that shapes your daily struggle. Beyond the inanimate forces of weather and landscape, you share this world with a host of wild animals, and they're not always the cute, cuddly creatures of storybooks. Wolves are a significant and persistent threat. They prey on your livestock, sheep, goats, even calves, and in lean times, or if an individual is old, young, or infirm, they might even attack humans. The howl of a wolf pack in the nearby forest at night is a sound that sends a shiver down your spine. Wolves were less dire wolf cool from some fantasy epic, and more direly going to eat your sheep and possibly your small child if you're not careful. Wild boar are also common, powerful animals with sharp tusks that can inflict terrible injuries if they are cornered or feel threatened. Hunting them is a dangerous sport, usually reserved for the nobility. Bears, though becoming rarer through the Anglo-Saxon period, were still present in the more remote wildernesses in the earlier centuries. Even smaller creatures can pose a risk. Adders, Britain's only native venomous snake, could deliver a nasty, sometimes fatal bite if you accidentally trod on one while gathering firewood or working in the fields. Some of the old English charms that survive are specifically designed to protect against snakebite or to treat it, often involving quite elaborate rituals. Forget anti-venom. Have you tried aggressive circular drawing around the wound while chanting very specific, slightly ominous verses? And sometimes nature unleashes its power on a larger scale. Rivers swollen by heavy rain or snowmelt can burst their banks, inundating entire valleys, sweeping away homes, livestock, and precious topsoil. Coastal communities live with the threat of storm surges, pushing the sea far inland. In hilly regions, prolonged rainfall can trigger landslides, burying fields and buildings. And as we've discussed, epidemics of disease can sweep through animal herds or human populations, often seen as a manifestation of nature's untamed power or divine judgment. Living so close to such raw, untamed power means you have a complex relationship with the natural world. There's a deep-seated respect, even fear for its capacity for destruction, but also a reliance on its bounty. You are constantly trying to carve out a space for yourself to push back the wilderness just enough to survive by clearing forests, draining small patches of marsh building, flimsy defenses against floods. And where practical measures fall short, you turn to the supernatural, as we saw in Section 8, attempting to appease the spirits of place using charms to ward off bad weather or animal attacks, and praying to your gods or God for protection from the elements. Nature is not your servant in this era. If anything, you are often at its mercy, a small, fragile human presence in a world that is still very much wild. Living at the mercy of nature's often unforgiving hand, as you do, means that every single day is a testament to the sheer physical effort required to simply exist. There's no easy button, No convenient shortcut to wresting a living from this demanding land. From the moment the first gray light of dawn seeps into your smoky hovel until the last vestiges of daylight fade, your life is one of almost continuous toil. The rewards for this unceasing labor. They are meager at best, often just enough to keep body and soul together, with little left over for what you might consider comfort or leisure. Your idea of a spa day is when it only rains moderately and no one in the village accidentally chops off a finger. The rhythm of your work is dictated by the sun and the seasons. In the long days of summer, the labor is intense and seemingly endless, focused on cultivating and harvesting the crops that will hopefully see you through the winter. We've talked about plowing with that awkward ard, often a wrestling match, with both the stubborn earth and your equally stubborn oxen. Imagine the strain on your back and shoulders, hour after hour, guiding that rudimentary blade through the soil, clearing rocks, untangling roots. Then comes sowing, walking endlessly up and down the furrows, hand broadcasting the precious seed. Weeding is a backbreaking agony of stooping and pulling for days on end under a hot sun or a persistent drizzle. And the harvest, the frantic communal effort of reaping with a sickle or scythe, the constant bending, lifting, and carrying of heavy sheaves. Your back, after a few seasons of this, probably has more kinks than a poorly made garden hose. Once the grain is gathered, it needs to be threshed, which involves rhythmically beating it with a heavy wooden flail until your arms feel like lead and the dust chokes your lungs. And let's not forget the daily grind of turning that grain into flour at the quern, a monotonous, muscle-straining task usually performed by the women of the household. Animal husbandry, too, demands constant attention. You're up early to milk the cows or goats if you're fortunate enough to have them. There's mucking out their byres, a fragrant and physically taxing job. Sheep need to be sheared, a process that's more like a prolonged, oily wrestling match with an uncooperative, bleeding opponent. You need to guard your livestock from predators and disease and ensure they have enough fodder, especially through the lean winter months. Then, there's the endless gathering of essential resources. Water doesn't magically appear from a tap. You, or more likely, your children, trudge back and forth to the nearest stream or well multiple times a day, carrying heavy wooden or pottery buckets. Firewood is another constant necessity. You're regularly heading into the woods to chop down trees, if you have the right to do so, or gather fallen branches, then hauling the heavy loads back to your village. This isn't just a quaint autumnal activity. It's a year-round chore, essential for cooking and providing a modicum of warmth. Add to this the hours spent foraging for supplementary foods, nuts, berries, edible roots, and herbs to eke out your family's diet. And what about your home, that cozy little hovel? It requires constant maintenance. The wattle and daub walls crack and crumble, needing regular patching with that delightful blend of mud, straw, and dung. The thatched roof, battered by wind and rain, will eventually leak and require rethatching, a skilled and labor-intensive job involving cutting, carrying, and carefully layering bundles of reeds or straw. Fences around your fields or animal pens need mending to keep your livestock in and wild, or your neighbor's animals out. All this work is done with the most basic of tools: simple axes, adzes, knives, perhaps a saw if you're lucky. These tools are an extension of your muscle power, not a replacement for it. They are often heavy and inefficient by our standards and require frequent sharpening and repair. For the women in your household, the domestic sphere is also a realm of unceasing physical labor. Cooking over an open, smoky fire involves managing the flames, dealing with the heat and smoke, and handling heavy iron pots. The journey from raw wool or flax to finished cloth is an incredibly long and arduous one. The fleece must be cleaned and carded, combing out the tangles, then spun into thread using a drop spindle, a process that takes countless hours of skilled handwork. Finally, the thread is woven into cloth on an upright loom, a large and cumbersome piece of equipment that requires you to stand for long periods, reaching and passing the shuttle back and forth. And all this, while also caring for young children, a physically demanding task in itself, with constant lifting, carrying, and supervising. The sheer physicality of these daily tasks performed year in and year out from a young age takes a heavy toll on your body. Skeletal remains from Anglo-Saxon cemeteries often show clear evidence of this relentless toil. Archaeologists find signs of osteoarthritis even in relatively young adults, evidence of stress fractures from repetitive actions and heavily developed muscle attachments indicating a life of hard physical exertion. You probably suffer from chronic aches and pains, a bad back, sore joints, stiff muscles that are just an accepted part of life. Injuries from accidents with tools or animals or simply from overuse are common. With no modern medicine, even a relatively minor injury can become a major problem if it gets infected or fails to heal properly. You'd age quickly, your body worn down by the relentless demands placed upon it. It's worth noting that even those who dedicated their lives to God weren't necessarily escaping hard labor. Many monastic rules, like the influential rule of Saint Benedict, which shaped Anglo-Saxon monasticism, placed great emphasis on manual work for monks as a core part of their spiritual discipline. Ora et labora, meaning pray and work. So even the monks were getting their daily steps in, and then some perhaps while contemplating the divine nature of a particularly stubborn turnip they were trying to dig up. Historians still argue about the exact number of work days versus rest days, holy days, festivals, Sundays, an average Anglo-Saxon peasant might have had, and how this balance or lack thereof impacted their overall workload and potential for rest and recuperation. But for you, as a sea oral, rest is a fleeting concept. The rewards for all this back-breaking effort are, as we've said, painfully meager. Your diet is monotonous, your shelter basic, your clothing coarse and functional. There are few, if any, of the comforts that you might take for granted today. Life is a primal struggle for survival, a constant expenditure of energy for the barest of returns. The deep, bone-weary exhaustion you feel at the end of each day is a faithful companion, a constant reminder of the endless toil that defines your existence. That deep, bone-weary exhaustion you feel at the close of each day, the constant throb of overworked muscles, the gnawing emptiness in your belly that even the coarsest pottage can't quite fill. These are the grim realities of your existence. The rewards for your endless toil are indeed painfully meager. Yet even in a life so dominated by hardship, the human spirit seeks out moments of respite, sparks of joy, however fleeting or rough-hewn they might be. Comforts, as you might understand them, soft beds, warm baths, a quiet evening with a good book, are almost entirely absent. But leisure, in its Anglo-Saxon form, does exist, offering brief, precious interludes in the relentless grind. Don't imagine neatly demarcated weekends or paid annual leave. Your leisure time isn't scheduled, it's snatched. It might be the brief lull between the frantic activity of harvest and the onset of winter plowing, or the long dark evenings when outdoor work is impossible. More often, it's tied to specific communal events. Religious festivals, a wedding in the village, a celebration marking a successful harvest, if you're lucky enough to have one, or perhaps your lord holding a feast to reward his retainers, an event you might glimpse from the fringes or benefit from indirectly. Feasting and drinking are central to these moments of communal pleasure. When the occasion calls for it, the ale flows more freely, and if it's a truly special event, there might even be mead, that potent honey-sweet brew that can make even the smokiest hovel feel a little warmer and the harshest life a bit more bearable. Your social lubricant is literally fermented honey or barley, and it does a remarkable job of easing tongues and fostering a temporary sense of bonhomie. Food, too, will be better than the daily fare. Perhaps there's roasted meat, a pig or even an ox if the feast is grand enough, a welcome change from the endless porridge and coarse bread. Eating together, sharing stories and laughter, these are powerful social bonds. The great timbered mead hall of a lord filled with the clamor of his thegns, the clinking of drinking horns, and the smell of roasting meat is the idealized setting for such celebrations. As a curel, you're unlikely to be a guest at the high table, but your own village will have its smaller, humbler gatherings, perhaps around a large outdoor bonfire or crowded into someone's slightly larger hut. In these moments of communal gathering, storytelling, and poetry take center stage. In a world where literacy is rare, the spoken word is immensely powerful. A skilled scop, a poet, storyteller, and musician rolled into one, is a highly valued individual. You would listen rapt as he, for they were usually men recites long epic poems filled with the deeds of ancient heroes, the battles of gods and monsters, the triumphs and tragedies of kings and queens. You wouldn't know it as Beowulf, but tales of dragon slayers, of loyal warriors fighting against overwhelming odds, of treacherous kin and fateful encounters, would stir your imagination and perhaps offer a temporary escape from your own mundane struggles. Riddles, too, provide a more interactive form of entertainment. We've mentioned the Exeter book Riddles before. These clever, often beautifully crafted verbal puzzles would test your wit and offer a different kind of intellectual stimulation. It's a way of preserving collective memory, reinforcing cultural values, and simply passing the time in an engaging way. Music and song are inseparable from these gatherings. The scop might accompany his recitation on a harty, a small, harp-like lyre, such as the famous one found in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which provides evidence for such instruments. Simple pipes made of bone or wood, perhaps a drum, to provide a rhythm, or the blast of a horn might also feature. People would sing work songs to lighten the load during communal tasks, celebratory songs at feasts, perhaps mournful laments for the dead. And where there's music, there's often dancing. Don't picture elegant courtly dances. This would be energetic, perhaps boisterous folk, dancing away to release pent-up energy and express collective joy. When you have a rare moment to yourself, or with a few companions, games offer a diversion. Board games were popular. Archaeologists have unearthed gaming pieces made of bone antler, polished stone, or even glass, along with fragments of playing boards. Games like Hnefatafel, a Germanic strategy game somewhat akin to chess, where one player tries to get their king to safety while the other tries to capture him, would have whiled away many an hour. Nine Men's Morris, a simpler game of alignment and capture, is another ancient pastime that you might enjoy scratching a board onto a flat piece of wood, or even directly onto the earth. Dice games, too, were common, perhaps involving a bit of gambling for small trinkets or bragging rights. Your version of an e-sport is aggressively moving a small carved wooden peg across a crudely drawn board, but the thrill of competition is just as real. Physical contests, wrestling matches, foot races, tests of strength like stone throwing, would also provide entertainment and a chance for young men to show off their prowess. Religious festivals, both the lingering pagan ones and the increasingly dominant Christian celebrations like Christmas, Yule, and Easter, punctuate the year and provide officially sanctioned breaks from work. These are important not just for their spiritual significance, but also as opportunities for the whole community to come together to feast, to play games, and to reaffirm social bonds. You might even have a slightly better tunic or cloak that you save for such occasions, a small nod to the festive spirit. It's crucial to remember, though, that these joys are fleeting and the comforts incredibly scarce. Leisure doesn't magically transport you to a world of luxury. You're still returning to your cold, smoky hovel at the end of the celebration. The pleasures are simple ones: the taste of that rare, sweet mead, the warmth of a roaring fire shared with friends and kin on a bleak winter's night, the sound of a beautifully told story that makes you forget your aching back for an hour or two, the satisfaction of a game well played, or even just the quiet contentment of watching your children laugh as they chase each other around the village green. Some Anglo-Saxon riddles, interestingly, are quite risque, full of deliberate double entendres. It seems even the monks, who often transcribed these texts, enjoyed a bit of bawdy humor, a sort of Old English "that's what she said" joke, suggesting a robust, earthy sense of fun that wasn't afraid to poke fun at the more basic aspects of life. Historians still argue about the extent to which these leisure activities were segregated by social class, or whether there was significant overlap in the pastimes enjoyed by nobles and peasants, albeit with obvious differences in the scale quality of food and drink and refinement of the entertainment. But whatever your station, these brief moments of shared human connection, of laughter and song, would have been vital oases of warmth in an otherwise harsh and demanding world. They are the small, flickering candles that illuminate the prevailing darkness, those brief flickering candles of joy and communal pleasure, the shared laughter at a feast, the rapt attention given to a scop's tale, the boisterous energy of a village dance. These moments are almost invariably experienced within the tight-knit framework of your kin and your relationship with your local lord. These connections are your lifeline in a harsh world, your primary source of identity support and protection. But they are a double-edged sword. For every bit of security or camaraderie they offer, they also come laden with heavy, often perilous obligations. The very relationships that define your place in the world also impose upon you a set of inescapable burdens that shape your every action and can at times feel utterly crushing. At the heart of much of Anglo-Saxon society, particularly for the warrior class, but filtering down to influence everyone, is the bond between a lord and his retainer. If you are a thegn, this is the core of your existence. You have sworn a sacred oath of fealty to your lord, perhaps in a solemn ceremony, your hand on holy relics, or even on his own ancestral sword. You've pledged to fight for him, to defend him with your life, to be his loyal follower through thick and thin. To abandon your lord in battle, especially if he is slain, is the ultimate disgrace, a stain on your honor that will follow you to your grave and bring shame upon your kin. Your lord in return is expected to be generous, a ring giver, a gold friend. He provides you with land, with weapons, with sustenance in his mead hall, with protection, and with leadership. He is in essence your employer, your landlord, your commanding officer, and your emergency contact, all rolled into one heavily armed and frequently demanding package. This reciprocal bond, known to historians through accounts like those of the Roman writer Tacitus describing the Germanic comitatus or war band, is fundamental. But the weight of that loyalty can be immense, demanding you risk life and limb at your lord's command. Then there is your mekth, your kin group, your extended family. In a world with no police force to call and few impartial courts, your kin are your primary social safety net, and often your biggest liability. They are the people you turn to in times of hardship, the ones who might help you rebuild if your harvest fails or your hovel burns down. Your status and reputation in the wider community are inextricably linked to that of your kin. But this interconnectedness comes at a steep price. The actions of one member of your mekth can bring dire consequences upon everyone. Remember those blood feuds we discussed. If your hot-headed cousin Leofwine gets into a brawl at the market and ends up killing someone from another family, it's not just Leofwine's problem. The entire kin group of the slain man will now look to your entire kin group for retribution, either in the form of a hefty weregild payment, or if that's not forthcoming or acceptable, through further violence. Suddenly, you who had nothing to do with the initial squabble, which might have been over something as trivial as a stray pig or a disputed debt, are now embroiled in a potentially multi-generational cycle of vengeance. Congratulations, your cousin spat over a chicken has just signed you up for a lifelong family vendetta. This collective responsibility is a powerful force for social cohesion, encouraging kin to police their own members, but it's also a source of constant underlying tension and potential danger. Marriages are often strategic affairs designed to forge alliances between kin groups or to act as peace weavers for Yodewebi, as a woman in such a role might be called to try and mend existing feuds. As a choral, a free peasant, your obligations are numerous. You owe fiorm, or food rent, to your lord. This isn't a polite suggestion. It's a substantial portion of your hard-won produce, grain ale, livestock, honey, that must be rendered up to keep his hall supplied and his retinue fed. This tribute is a constant drain on your resources, making it difficult to accumulate any surplus for yourself. Then there's furd service. When your lord or the king calls you, must drop your plow, pick up your spear, which you probably have to provide yourself, and march off to fight, leaving your farm and family to fend for themselves. This could mean weeks or even months away, facing the perils of battle, with no guarantee you'll return. Some lords might also require you to perform labor services on their own domain land for a certain number of days each year, further eating into the time you have to work your own fields. There's immense pressure to conform to fulfill your duties without complaint. Your individual desires often take a distant second place to the needs of your kin and the demands of your lord. Even those higher up the social ladder, the thegns and the lords themselves, are not free from burdens. A lord needs to maintain his retinue of warriors, and that means he must be consistently successful in war to acquire plunder and land which he can then distribute as gifts. No gold, no guys, is a pretty accurate summary of the situation. Generosity is a key virtue of lordship. A stingy or unlucky lord will soon find his followers drifting away to serve someone more capable or open-handed. He is also responsible for administering justice within his territory, settling disputes among his followers, and ensuring the laws are upheld. This requires wisdom, fairness, and sometimes a strong hand. And he lives in a state of constant vigilance, wary of rival lords seeking to expand their own power, of potential raiders, and even of disloyalty from within his own ranks. Leadership is a heavy mantle to bear. Historians still argue about the degree of autonomy individual sea orals actually possessed versus the extent of their dependence on and control by their lords, particularly as the period progressed and ideas about land tenure and service evolved towards what would later become manorialism. Was your relationship with your lord primarily one of reciprocal benefit, or was it increasingly one of subjugation? The answer likely varied across time and region. What is clear is that your life is a complex web of interconnected duties and loyalties. Your commitment to your lord might sometimes clash with your obligations to your kin. Imagine your lord orders you to attack a neighboring village, but you have relatives living there. Where does your primary loyalty lie? Such dilemmas could tear a person apart. The oaths you swear are taken with utmost seriousness, often on sacred objects, making them magically and spiritually binding. To break such an vow is not just a social misstep. It's seen as a profound betrayal that could have spiritual consequences. The weight of these expectations, the constant potential for conflict, the ever-present risk that your lord's quarrel or your kinsman's folly will drag you into mortal danger. These are the invisible chains that bind you as tightly as any physical restraint. They are the price of belonging in Anglo-Saxon England, the heavy weight of those obligations to your kin and your lord, the constant threat of a feud erupting or a battle looming. These are threads woven through the fabric of your life, and they often lead directly to the stark reality of your own mortality. In a world where life is so frequently cut short by violence, disease, or simple accident, death is not a distant abstract concept. It's a familiar, almost commonplace visitor. And so you and your contemporaries have developed ways of facing this inevitable end, shaped by your beliefs about what, if anything, lies beyond the veil of this hard existence. In the earlier pagan centuries, before Christianity cast its long shadow, your understanding of the afterlife is perhaps a little murky, but no less potent. You see evidence of this in how you treat your dead. When a great lord or king dies like the one famously commemorated in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, from the early 7th century, he is sent on his way with an astonishing array of possessions. His ship becomes his tomb, filled with his helmet and shield, his sword, and spear's gold buckles and garnet inlaid jewelry, feasting bowls, cauldrons, even silver spoons. The saying, "You can't take it with you," clearly hadn't fully caught on with these folks. They certainly gave it a good try. This suggests a belief that such items would be useful, or at least reflect his status in some other realm. Perhaps it's a shadowy underworld, a long journey to a land of the dead, or maybe for a renowned warrior, a place in a feasting hall with his ancestors and his gods, though the vivid details of a Valhalla are more explicitly Norse than distinctly Anglo-Saxon. What truly matters is lof and dom, praise for your deeds in life and the judgment or reputation that lives on after you're gone. Your name being sung by Scops is a form of immortality. You might practice cremation, especially in these earlier times, the funeral pyre consuming the body and sending the spirit onwards with the smoke. Or you might choose inhumation, burying the body, often with those cherished grave goods. Sometimes, these buried weapons are found deliberately killed. A sword bent a spearhead broken. Perhaps this was to release the weapon's spirit to travel with its owner, or to deter grave robbers by rendering the items useless, or simply to signify that the warrior's fighting days were truly over. Making sure your afterlife spear doesn't get accidentally picked up by some afterlife goblin looking for a bargain, one might quip. As Christianity takes root and spreads your perspective on death, and what follows undergoes a profound transformation. The options become starker, more defined heaven or hell, an eternity of blissful paradise in the presence of God for the righteous, or an eternity of unimaginable torment for unrepentant sinners. This isn't just an abstract theological shift. It has a direct and powerful impact on how you try to live your life, and crucially, how you prepare for your death. The idea of a last judgment, when Christ will return to judge all souls, adds an urgency to this. Now, a good death becomes paramount. This means dying in a state of grace, if possible. You hope to have time for confession, to receive absolution from a priest, perhaps to be anointed with holy oil. Dying suddenly, unprepared, unshriven. That's a terrifying prospect. The Church teaches that the prayers of the living can aid the souls of the departed, perhaps easing their journey, or helping them if they are in some intermediate state. Before reaching heaven, the concept of purgatory as a distinct place develops more fully later, but the underlying idea of a post-mortem purification helped by prayer is present. This leads to changes in burial practices too. Inhumation becomes the norm. Usually in consecrated ground around a church, the body often oriented east-west awaiting the resurrection. Grave goods become far less common. Your spiritual preparedness is what matters now, not your worldly possessions. Regardless of whether your beliefs are rooted in the old pagan ways or the new Christian faith, the act of dying itself is something you likely face with a certain stoicism born of a life accustomed to hardship. If you're fortunate, you'll be surrounded by your kin, your family offering what comfort they can. You'll know that life for most is short and often brutal. Reaching what passes for old age, your 40s or 50s, is an achievement in itself. Your main concern about dying, if you were to make a grim joke, might be whether you've mended enough socks for the long journey ahead, or if you remember to tell your son where you buried those few silver coins. Funerary rituals remain important. There would be wakes, where family and friends gather to mourn, to feast, and to remember the deceased. Laments might be sung stories of their life shared. For the prominent, their deeds might be commemorated in poetry or song, ensuring their Dom lives on. Later in the period, carved stone crosses might mark important graves or serve as public memorials. Underpinning all of this, both pagan and Christian, is a powerful sense of word, a concept akin to fate or destiny. It's a sense that there's an underlying order or unfolding to events occurrent that pulls lives along, sometimes regardless of individual will or even the intervention of gods or God. It doesn't necessarily mean a passive acceptance of everything, but an acknowledgement of powerful forces beyond human control. Historians still argue about how quickly and thoroughly Christian eschatological beliefs, that is, beliefs about death judgment and the final destiny of the soul, replaced older pagan conceptions of the afterlife among the general populace, or if a kind of double belief system where old superstitions and new doctrines uneasily coexisted, persisted for a considerable time. It's likely that for many ordinary people, the lines were blurred for generations. So as your own time approaches, whether in the smoky dimness of your hovel surrounded by grieving family, or perhaps more violently on a blood-soaked battlefield, you face the unknown. You've navigated a life defined by relentless toil, by the bonds of kinship and lordship, by the fear of hunger, and the ever-present shadow of conflict. You've lived by your wits, your strength, and your adherence to the complex rules of your society and the often inscrutable demands of the spiritual world. What awaits you now is the ultimate mystery faced with the same resilience and perhaps a touch of weary resignation that has characterized your entire journey through this brutal, challenging, and yet undeniably human world of Anglo-Saxon England. The fire in your hearth, once a small beacon against the vast, untamed darkness of the land, now dwindles to embers, its warmth receding. The tales of ancient heroes and the lamentations for fallen kinsmen fade into the quiet hum of the night. You have walked with us through a landscape of immense hardship, where every sunrise brought a renewed struggle for survival, where the bonds of loyalty were as heavy as they were vital, and where the comforts of life were scarce and hard-won. You've felt the biting wind on the coast, the strain of the plow in heavy soil, the smoky air of the longhouse stinging your eyes. You've known the fear of the raider's cry and the solemn weight of an oath sworn to your lord. You've glimpsed the world through eyes that saw spirits in the rustling leaves and omens in the flight of birds. A world slowly, sometimes painfully yielding to a new faith, promising a different kind of salvation. Life, then, was a tapestry woven with threads of incredible toughness, of deep community, and of a raw, often unmediated engagement with the very elements of existence. The anxieties were profound, the dangers ever present, yet through it all, these people endured. They built homes, raised families, tilled the unforgiving earth, and sought meaning in a world that offered few easy answers. As the last echoes of their world recede from our thoughts, tonight perhaps, we can appreciate the quiet strength it took simply to live day by day in that long-ago time. The night deepens around you, now a soft blanket of stillness. Let the journey we've taken settle into the quiet corners of your mind and allow the peace of the present moment to envelop you completely. Sweet dreams,